G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this is a tutorial on animation. It's the second tutorial in which I'm working on this character where I've already created the keyframe planning and the breakdowns, and they look sort of like this. So we've got his motion moving from pose to pose. In the previous tutorial we kind of mapped out how to plan that motion and create arcs and lines of motion. And now that we've got all of that in place, this is my first keyframe drawn completely and colored completely. Now, we're not going to be drawing each frame and coloring each frame as we go. There's a bit of a process to it. Before I get started, I want to highly recommend, again, this book by Richard Williams. It's called the Animators Survival Kit. Look it up on Amazon. It is your Bible. It is really worth getting if you're interested in animation, specifically keyframe animation and pose to pose, sort of frame by frame stuff. So in approaching the next stage, now that we've got the motion planned, we're going to be creating the line work, and this is one of the more time-consuming parts of it because we're creating a refined picture from these really rough sketches, but we also have to maintain proportions while also maintaining that intensity of motion. So it can be quite difficult. We often are going to be referring back to our first finished drawing. I tend to like to start off with one first finished frame and then all the rest I kind of do incrementally. Now I'm not doing this chronologically. I'm not going to be drawing this frame and then this frame and then this frame. I'm actually going to be drawing the keyframes line work. So I'm going to be drawing the line work of this picture, then the line work of this picture, and then the line work of this picture. Okay, so I'm going to be drawing 3 images. Now here's something quite important to remember. When doing line work, your poses, your main keyframes have to be well done. They have to be focused on and refined in a way that looks polished and finished. Next down on the hierarchy of priorities are the breakdown poses. So these motion accentuation ones, you want to draw the line work reasonably well, but it doesn't have to be as polished as these main keyframes where we're resting in the main intense sort of poses, right? So we want to really focus on the keyframes. Then in our breakdowns, we want it to look like a decent, reasonable, believable transition, and then the in-between line work isn't as important. We don't have to be as refined. We still want it to look good, and if you want to be super refined, especially in very subtle motions, you can and probably should. But if we're kind of on a budget with time, that's something you can skimp out on, but you can't skimp out on the keyframe poses. So what I'm going to do now is, using this pose as a reference, I'm going to put it immediately before, and I'm going to set my onion skin up so I can see, I'll lock that bottom frame, so I can see the pose that I'm going to be ending up drawing and the pose that I've begun working with. Okay, so I can see that the head's going to have to move back a bit, the arms are going to be up here, and the torso I'm going to move back a little bit as well. So I'm going to get my black line, and I'm not going to draw the details of the face yet because that, in my opinion, is the most difficult thing to get right, because they're very subtle proportions where if you change the nose or the mouth or the chin a little bit, it looks like a completely different character. So I'm going to be very careful with that and come back to that later. Now you'll notice that this drawing doesn't have a towel, whereas these sketches do. That's because I'm going to come back later on and animate the cloth, and it's going to be a separate tutorial. For now, we're going to be going about the anatomy. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to draw the arm. So we have the bicep bulging here, and drawing in the rest of the arm, there's quite a focus on a bulging bicep here because he's showing off to some bystanders. So we want to really make sure that his showing off isn't in vain. He's got something to show off. And we don't want to be overly detailed as well. That's one of the reasons it's preferred to not have a huge amount of detailed line work in these characters that we end up frame by frame animating, because you can see that every single line adds a bit of time, and then those little bits of time add up over, let's say, 100 frames of animation where you're drawing every second or third frame from scratch. Each line really means something. Okay, so we really just want to keep it to the bare essentials. The bare necessities are Mother Nature's recipes. So you can see I'm basically following the very sketchy silhouette that I've set up behind while using the finished artwork of the first pose as a bit of a reference for both proportions and line work. Okay, so I'm using the sketchy bit as positioning guide, but I'm using the first finished and refined image more than the sketchy bit, really, because the sketchy bit's quite easy to follow. It's getting the lines refined and the picture looking like an actual refined picture that is the difficult part. Making it look like a sequential image, making it look like it's the same character just in a moved pose. So now that I've got the body drawn, I'm turning off my onion skin just because it's a little easier to see, and now I flick between these frames just to see how the motion looks. Now I can hide that reference layer, and I can see how the line work compares. I can see little motion changes that don't work very well. Now what I'm actually doing is using the comma and full stop button on the keyboard, which is also that and that symbol, the more and less than symbol, to jump between frames, and I can see the inconsistency. So here in that foot, the shoe changes badly, so I'm just going to redraw that so it's not as bad. Just anchor it forward a bit. Torso all looks pretty decent. I've got to draw this line here, and the arms look decent as well. Okay, so I've left the head. Now we're going to do the head, and this is a little trickier. Now the other thing that we want to remember is that we want to change the poses in the face as well, and we haven't really drawn the detail in the face. That is my final pose face, and it doesn't really show enough, and I'm not going to have it in that pose. I want to change it with each pose. In this one I'm going to have his mouth open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in to, let's say, 220, and I'm going to select a larger brush size to match the other brush size because it doesn't scale when you zoom. I'll just draw just to make sure. Okay, that looks okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my onion skin again just to see the previous frame, and I want to draw one thing at a time. So first things first, I'm going to draw the sunglasses. So I'm going to draw the top frame of the sunglasses. That seems like a decent motion. I'm going to draw the nose, tilt it up a bit, draw the ear, kept down because his head is being tilted up, and I'm going to start refining the shape. Now, whenever I want to see more clearly what's happening, I can turn off my onion skin and hide the layer underneath, or with the layer underneath hidden, simply have my onion skin on and see without as much mess what's happening, and make whatever tweaks I want to make, and then go back to showing my reference. So it can be quite visually confusing. I recommend just sticking at it. If you're learning frame by frame animation, I recommend taking it slow, doing simpler shapes and characters first before doing this sort of thing, because you can see I have three things I'm looking at here. I've got my very rough sketchy grey drawing, I've got my onion skinned first pose, and then I've got the line work of what I'm actually drawing right now. And it can be quite overwhelming if we've got too much busyness happening, and we need to be able to kind of alternate between them, flick back and forth to make sure we're catching the right motion. So here I've noticed that the glasses shrink a little too much for my liking, so I'm just going to grab this whole thing and stretch it like this. Now I can flick back and forth and see that it's slightly better. Again, pull it up a bit more till I'm happy with it, and I'm happy with that. So there you go, it's a process. Let's give him a different pose in his face. I'm going to have this eyebrow down and this eyebrow up like this. So we have actually something interesting happening in his face. Let's change his mouth. Let's give him an open mouth shape. So I'm going to draw his mouth open. The teeth are on this downwards angle, which is a bit tricky to draw sometimes because it can look a bit contrasting. I want to make sure that things look visually correct. And if I want to intensify the motion or alter it, I can just grab the whole thing and rotate it. I want the chin to be in place, which is going to be a bit tricky because it's going to mean affecting this collarbone that I've drawn. So I'm just going to totally drag that out. So I can drag it in if I want it back in there, just so I can clear this space under the chin. And I'm going to draw the jaw. I want to maintain the proportions. I've got to be really sticklerish with this, because in getting the jaw proportions wrong, we've kind of totally changed the shape of the face. So I've got to make sure it looks good. Turn off my onion skin and I'll alternate between these frames to see how it looks. And I'm fairly happy with that. Now the hair's going to be a tricky one because the whole thing is on a different angle. Yeah, see, this is where it's getting a bit more difficult. So we need to pull all the hair back and kind of hide it behind the skull a little bit because everything's on a different angle as is looking up more. Just alternate between those two. So that looks a bit better, but I think there needs to be more spikes over here. You can see that this is quite a tricky visual process, and you can understand why a lot of people kind of get started and then give up very easily because it's very visually confusing. It's difficult and confusing in a lot of ways. It's difficult with proportions, it's difficult to get the line work correct, and motion itself is extremely difficult to make look good. So here we go. I've got my two poses and I'm quite happy with that transition. I do want to angle the whole thing a little bit more like this, and let's have a look at those. Okay, so that looks good, I reckon. I think the back needs to come up a bit more, have a bit more of a kick up. So here we go, we have that transition between the two frames, and we want to make 100% sure that the size and shape of the head is the same between them. Because one thing that happens all the time to me and experienced animators as well as beginners is if this head is just a little bit smaller than the head on the frame before, and then let's say 5 frames later I draw the head a little bit smaller than the head 5 frames before, then all of a sudden 50 frames from now we have this tiny head, and we watch the animation start to finish and we see how it's shrinking. Right? So we've got to really be vigilant, and that's why I say we're going to be using the first pose quite consistently, because while I'm happy with this pose, rather than the next pose being solely compared to this pose and then this next pose that I do, which will be on this shape, and this next pose that I'll do, rather than comparing them simply to the keyframe before, I need to both compare it to the keyframe before and the first keyframe, because we need to maintain proportion and we need to maintain line work and shape. So having explained that, that is my first pose drawn in a more refined way, and we can see if I hide my line work underneath, we can see that that actually looks pretty refined. I'm quite happy with that. It looks like a finished artwork, and that's the goal. You don't want it to look scribbly or in any way messy, because we're resting here roughly for 30 or so frames. Okay, so that's a full second that someone's going to be watching this, and if something's a bit lumpy or out of place or misproportioned because we have so many frames and we're just kind of rushing through it all, they're going to notice. So if you're going to focus on anything, really focus on the key frame. So here's our first one, and that's our next keyframe, and what I'm going to be doing now is animating the other keyframes, and I'll fast forward through the process, and then I'm going to go through the breakdown line work, and I'll explain a little bit of how you can simplify that process and do it a bit easier. But in the same way that I focused on really having a refined line work and shape, and maintaining proportions and everything with this keyframe, I'm going to do the same with another 2, and I'll fast forward the process so you can kind of see how that works. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, I've created my next keyframe pose. I'm going to talk about a few quick simple things. First things first is you'll notice that I changed my sketch pose base to a different color to differentiate them slightly more than when it was just the grey. So that's something you can do. And then in the end also I use this, which is a wireframe button in Flash, which turns the whole thing into a very light wireframed drawing as a reference. And so I use that as a reference, and it's much simpler to follow when I have a clear drawing of the grey previous frame and then the wireframe of the current pose that I'm drawing. So it just makes it quite simple and a bit easier to do. And the next thing I'm going to do is take my first finished piece and move into this pose on a new layer, hit paste, and I just want to make sure everything is in proportion. So the legs, the waist, that all looks normal, the torso looks fine, and the arms and hands seem to follow it slightly, although the right arm is a little small here, so I'm just going to bring this out, pull it out a bit like this. There we go, so that's made that a little bit bigger. Then we have the head. Now the head's a trickier one because I want to check it properly, so I'm going to put it on the frame underneath, and I'm just going to flip this horizontally, transform, flip horizontal, and I'm just going to do this, underlay it there. I'm also going to make it at a low alpha so I can just compare without too much visual busyness, angle it, and it looks like the proportions are almost right. The hair just could use a bit of a fixer-upper, so I'm just going to now it's on a bit more of an angle, it's a bit more of a tilted up angle, so it doesn't necessarily matter that it's not exactly right because the hair is more angled back, but it just needed to be a bit bigger, so I just made that a bit bigger. Otherwise the chin and the facial structure, the dividing between the nose and the eye size, the glasses size I should say, and all that stuff seems to be on par. So there you go, I've done my comparisons and I've drawn the keyframe, and there we go. I'm just going to hide my reference layer, and you can see that now I have two keyframes that I've drawn the line work to. So this is my first pose. This is my first keyframe that I've drawn the line work to, and this is my second one. And I have one more keyframe pose to the right here, and I'm going to do that now with it sped up so you can see the process a little clearer and faster as well. And so there we are, ladies and gentlemen. I have drawn 3 keyframe poses and used the first one as a reference for all of them, just to make sure that the anatomy, the proportions and the line work don't get too far out of whack, just to keep them fairly similar. So what I've got happening here, I'm just making sure that everything's on the right angle. You know, for example here the torso is stretched up on an angle to the right, whereas in this one it's kind of pushed down, and we want to make sure everything kind of works in well and we have a proper 3-dimensional sort of shape, that, you know, the skin's folding in here and that we get the hips on that angle. but the feet are still maintaining their correct proportions. Oops, I've pulled the timeline out. So you can see this bottom right foot is in exactly the same position every single time, and we don't want too much variation between them, although if there is minor variation it won't matter too much. So now the next thing to do is work on the breakdown poses, which are these much more motion centric ones, where you can see if I take off the wireframe, it's very much more motion based, and it's the between keyframe poses that show the larger portion of motion. So next I'm going to go forward and do these breakdown poses using the same process, but I'm going to be a little looser, and you'll see that it doesn't have to be perfect. I want to maintain everything mostly to be, you know, pretty well done. But the fact is these frames only show for like 1/5 of a second each, so it's not a huge deal if everything's a little askew, as long as the motion is there and the proportions are mostly the same. The line work isn't as important, things like that. So I'm going to go forward and do that all in fast forward, because it is a very time consuming process, and you may not know it, but it's already been several hours that I've been working on this animation, and it's just been sped up so you can kind of see it all broken down and explained in parts. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen, I've finished drawing the breakdown frames, and it may seem like it didn't take very long, but I assure you it did. It took several hours to do that, and I just sped it up to 1000%, but I will take you through here, and the next process is basically refining the motion a little bit and just fixing up very little bits along the way. So what I tend to do is go to the first frame and just flick back and forth between the two frames with my back and forth button. Like I said, it was the greater than and less than, or the comma and the full stop. So in flicking through these, just looking at one area at a time, so I'm looking at the face, I'm quite happy with how that's working, how the hair is kind of moving, the limbs I'm happy with, the torso I'm happy with. So moving to the next one. So one thing I do want to fix here is that in this stretch, the torso stretches but the legs don't, and I actually want the legs to stretch a little more and the torso not as much. So I'm just going to grab all of this area, pull it up, skew it across, and then I'm going to grab all the bottom area, pull it up and skew it across. It's just kind of fixed a little bit of that proportion that I was hoping to get. Then going down to this one, I'm pretty happy with how this looks, not too much to fix there. Now let's go over to the other segment. Okay, so as you can see in the turning of the head looks a little weird, but to be completely honest, I'm not too fussed. I think it's totally fine to have a little disproportion in turning a face in a very short segment like this. Like I said, this section here goes for less than 1/4 of a second, so it actually won't be that noticeable as long as the head at the start and the head at the finish are strong and maintain their proportions. The middle just needs to be somewhat similar. One thing I do want to do is I want to grab this foot and I'm just going to skew it up just to show a little bit more of that motion, like it's being flopped down. Flicking between these two, I feel like they're pretty good. I'm happy with that motion. Going up here towards the back, we see this first frame. I've got two stretchy things happening here. This foot is being really pulled up just to show a really quick motion in the foot. And this hand, as you can see, has a lot of this weird warping happening, and that's just my indication of showing a lot of speed without necessarily having to break it down over the several frames. Next frame, similar thing, a little more warping here and a little warping in the finger just to show that flicking down, and you'll see in the next tutorial how that takes shape. And then we have it restoring up to here. So I'm actually quite happy with how that works. I'm going to play it through now. Okay, and I'm very happy with how that turned out. So the next stage, ladies and gentlemen, is doing the in-between line work, and that will be in our next video tutorial, so I will catch you later. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you later.